The dream is the small hidden door in the deepest and most intimate sanctum of the soul, which opens to that primeval cosmic night that was soul long before there was conscious ego, and will be soul far beyond what a conscious ego could ever reach. Carl Jung. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I am your host. I'd like to thank everyone for coming in and listening this week. If this is your first time, welcome. I hope you enjoy, and I hope you'll continue to listen. And if you're a returning listener, thank you so much, as always. So, this week, we should be able to cover all of the major points I want to talk about when talking about the Aboriginal Australians between 8,000 and 6,000 BCE. And we might need one more episode, but we will see about that. We'll just have to see how it goes, see how long I ramble and take to talk about things. But if I don't complete it this week, we will complete it next week, and then we'll move on to Europe. Now, the week following is Labor Day weekend here in America, and there's a lot of things that happen during that time of year, and that Monday, I will not have an episode out. I may have a bonus episode out the following day, but it's not going to be a true episode. It'll be like a bonus. It'll be something that's not quite as important or as serious as everything else we talk about. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to be doing some traveling and all that kind of stuff, and I will not be back in my space to record for that period. But I will have a kind of a short bonus episode out, maybe that Tuesday or that Wednesday. We'll just have to wait and see. And then the following week we'll have a normal episode, as always. Now, before we get into the meat of this episode, I did have some feedback from a couple of people, and I also had a clarification I wanted to get to, I wanted to make for something I had said. First, someone asked me about the Negrito peoples living in parts of Asia and how exactly they're related to the Aboriginal peoples of Australia and Melanesia. So the most recent genetic studies that I've read about are from 2021. And I think I might have referred to them very briefly in season 1, like kind of in passing. I don't think I really dived into it that much then or during the episodes when I talked about Java, Borneo, or the Philippines, either this season or in season 2. I essentially what these studies say is that based off remains found in the Philippines and Sulawesi, the first Homo sapiens on those islands split from the Sahulians, which are the ancestors of Aboriginals and New Guineans or Papuans. The immediate group before those two groups kind of diverged genetically. So the first Philippines and Sulawesi split from the Sahulians before they divided into Papuans and Australians. But after the East Asians split off from the shared ancestors of the Sahulian and Negrito populations. Now, another thing I wanted to do, this is the point I wanted to make my clarification with. When I was speaking about Melanesia as a whole, while they do in general have darker skin than Polynesians or Micronesians, there are some groups that do have lighter skin that appear closer to Polynesian or Micronesian. And there are cases where the opposite is true. There are Polynesians or Micronesians that look more like Melanesians. Yet despite this difference in skin tone, all of these groups consider themselves Melanesian, Polynesian, Micronesian because of their geography and their cultural similarities, linguistics, shared histories, etc. So they place much less of an emphasis on skin tone than, say, peoples in the Americas or in Europe, though, again, that's not always the case, but it is much more likely. Now, to get back to the focus of this week's episode, we talked about how Australia was separated from New Guinea, and while the sea levels probably weren't quite as high as they are today, they aren't. Yeah, no, wait. The sea levels probably weren't quite equal to what they are today. They were very close. And they did leave kind of another isolated group, which I haven't mentioned yet. This was due to me grouping them with the Aboriginal Australians. And there are a couple of reasons for this that I'll talk about shortly. I'm referring to the people known as the Torres Strait Islanders. Now, the Torres Strait is the section of ocean that goes from the north of the Cape York Peninsula to the shores of New Guinea. That's that little, if you look at a map of Australia, it's the peninsula that's just kind of like a little small, maybe finger pointing up on the eastern side of Australia. Its name comes from the Spanish explorer, or I should say the name of the strait comes from the Spanish explorer Luis Vaz de Torres, or de Torres, excuse me. Now, there has been a push recently for an indigenous term for the region to kind of be co-recognized. The one that is the most prominent, in fact, it may be the only one as far as I know, is the term Zenada Kes or Zenadith Kes. And this is an acronym of ZE or ZE, which means south, NA, which stands for Nege, which means north, D is the representative for the word Dagam, which means place or side, and then TH, which stands for Thawathwa, which is coastline. And Kes is the word meaning passage, channel, or waterway. And it was added to make it clear that it was basically added to Zenada later. So it was initially the term they first proposed was Zenada, and then later Kes was added onto that to make it a little bit clearer to what it was. Now, according to the Torres Island Strait Regional Council's website, this was workshopped with input from members of the Western Islands, which is a grouping of the Torres Islands, and local elders from that region and the region as a whole. So from all the island sections that kind of belong to that region. The Torres Strait is 150 kilometers or 93 miles wide at its narrowest extent. And there are around somewhere between 270 to 280 islands in that region. And altogether, these islands make up only around 220 square miles or 570 square kilometers of land. Now, in terms of sea area, the region is around 48,000 square kilometers and about 19,000 square miles. So you have a lot of sea area to cover, not nearly as much as land. Now, these islands may not have been occupied at the point that our podcast is focusing on. It's very much a debated issue, and it's one of the mysteries of Australian prehistory that I kind of referred to last time. Climate, ocean, geographic features, all this together make finding evidence hard to pin down. And it's possible that some of the islands were occupied, abandoned, and then reoccupied before becoming permanent homes. Or it's possible that, some groups may have just gone fishing out to the islands, but only stay for a couple of weeks, then they go back home. Stuff like that, wouldn't leave too much of a record. Again, archaeology works best when you have a very long period of time of the same event or similar events happening. it's hard to get just one single point in time for archaeologists. Now, the earliest dates where we find evidence for permanent usage to the islands is around 18,000-ish BCE, but there are some older examples, and I don't think it's all that crazy to assume that people may have been visiting the islands earlier than that. Now, from what I have read, most of the islanders are more closely related to Papuan Melanesians than the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, but they have more language overlap, with the Aboriginal peoples. Though all of this varies, of course, from island to island and from tribe to tribe. They do not, nor have they ever considered themselves one ethnic group. They're all very proud of their particular cultures and customs, though in the modern day, the various tribes and First Peoples of the islands and the mainland do display solidarity when fighting for either recognition or concessions from the various levels of Australia's governments and courts and economic concerns, all that kind of stuff. And also I should point out, and this kind of goes back to how they're related, the Torres Island people do appear to have been a separate group. They appear to have all diverged genetically prior to that 1800 date, or 18,000-ish BCE. So it's possible that they were living, on the mainland of New Guinea, or the island of New Guinea, isolated, and then as time went on, they migrated off the island due to changes happening in New Guinea itself that we'll talk about when we get to that period of time. So just keep that in mind. The Torres Island Straits, their people there are ancient, or at least old enough to be a distinct group. But how long they've actually lived on those islands, while it has been a long time, might not be quite as long as what we're talking about. But we can't say that firmly one way or the other. And I say that, not to diminish their claims to land or anything, because again, they have been living on the islands for a while. How long, we don't know. And, obviously they were the first peoples there, so take of that as you will. Now, I would say that they are probably being, the islands themselves, if they're not being used, they are probably being used, or the area where those islands now occupy, were probably being lived in before the water levels rose, before, Australia and New Guinea got separated. Those regions were probably mountainous, which we know that there are groups in New Guinea that like the mountains. Like, that's how they got so isolated in that region, because the mountains were very good homes. Now, possibly due to the rapidly rising water levels, it could have made people hesitant to return, because they don't know, they wouldn't necessarily have a way to explain why the waters rose as quickly as they did. It's possible that the rising tides could have wiped out some groups completely, and that may have explained the hesitation for people to fully reoccupy the islands until a later period. They probably would have, if they weren't continuously occupied, people probably would have slowly returned to hunt or fish in those waters, look for material, and then after a period of time of becoming more comfortable doing that, then they return and live there fully, permanently. And we'll talk about kind of the long memory of humanity, and specifically Aboriginal people and other pre-literate societies. Excuse me. That's something we'll talk about here and in future episodes as well. But For now, we're going to move on to the island continent of Australia. Now, the name Australia comes from the term Australis or Australis, which is Latin for south. And this term, or some variation of it, usually Terra Australis or Southland, has been used since around the 400s AD to represent kind of a hypothetical landmass south of India, or just a blob of like what could be land or just could be like filler on a map. And now this hypothetical landmass was based on a theory developed by an influential 2nd century philosopher, Ptolemy of Alexandria, who had himself been influenced by earlier Roman and Greek thinkers and theorists. So, despite what you may have heard online, those really old maps with the giant blank landmass are not depicting the ice wall around a flat Earth or a lost continent that just keeps getting copied onto maps from older maps despite sinking for a few millennia prior to maps even being created. Just throw that out. Just throwing that out there for everyone. Now, despite the antiquity of the term, it wasn't applied to the actual continent of Australia until around 1800, 1805, somewhere in that range, by the British. And even then, other terms persisted. New Holland was one such term, and Ullamarora was used by some Scandinavian and German language maps. New Holland obviously comes from Dutch explorers to the region, and Ullamarora was a name that a Swedish geographer, Daniel Djurberg, got from the Maori of New Zealand. Though it should be pointed out that the accuracy of this name has been questioned very heavily. The most popular explanation is that this name is actually referring to the large islands, one of the larger islands in Fiji or New Caledonia. And I'm not going to go into the details on that right now. Probably won't even get to that, until we talk about the Europeans exploring the region, which is many, many episodes from now. Now, there is no one Aboriginal Australian term for Australia. Like most of the peoples of New Guinea, the Aboriginal hunter-gatherers of Australia were remarkably sedentary, and in fact were even more so than the people of New Guinea. They seem to have reached a region that they preferred, that appealed to them for whatever reason, and then they migrated in that region internally. They would rarely leave a range. One group leaving from their traditional homeland to another is very, very rare indeed. So they typically only name places that were in their immediate surroundings, or maybe of locations that had special cultural or religious significance. In fact, there is so little travel and intermarriage between these groups that it can be said that in, just an example, groups in Southwest Australia have less in common, genetically speaking, with groups in the northeast of Australia than some Native Americans, at least northern Native Americans, have in common with Native Siberians. The Native Americans in North America are more closely related to the Siberians than groups on opposite ends of Australia are to each other. Now that's kind of changing somewhat with travel across the continent becoming more possible due to the modern technology. There are examples of Aboriginal Australians intermarrying with various groups who they would not normally have been able to even ever meet in the past. I've watched a number of videos online from a gentleman, and I forget his name, but his father was kind of from the north central side of Australia, and his mother's people were from the far southeast. So he has a lot of different examples, and he's knowledgeable of both of their languages and kind of what they had in terms of terminology for kind of the same technology or same concepts. Now, for when these places were first occupied, we reach one of the other big mysteries of Australian prehistory. Perhaps the largest mystery of the Australian prehistory. How did people expand across the continent? Essentially, there are 5 major theories. One is that they just spread coming down from Sahul all along that connected land border. And they just kind of spread from north to south, from east to west, all at the same time. The second theory is that they entered from the northwest and then fanned out from there in all directions, with some groups then moving south or north when they hit the east coast. The third option is that they migrated through what is now the Cape York Peninsula, and then they made their way south to what will become Tasmania, with various groups breaking off and moving west at various points during the primary southward expansion. Then fourth, we have the theory that they arrived in the northwest and spread along the coast in that region before a group broke off and migrated to the east coast, with another group breaking off during that trip to head to the middle of the continent and then toward the southwest. While descendants of the group that made it all the way to the east coast moved south to occupy the southeastern corner and Tasmania. Then we have the final theory that they entered to the northwest, and then you had some groups split off from this initial peopling and occupy the coast, while some of the splinter groups headed along the northern and east coasts and going along the west and southern coasts, and then each of these migration waves seeing other groups break off and make their way for the interior. Each of these theories is based on archaeological evidence. From what I can tell, none of these places or pieces of technology or tools that they find can be definitively dated as the earlier evidence. It seems that whatever artifacts or whatever that you can find can always be placed in a date range. That means it could be older, but it could also be newer than other artifacts. Definitively dating things to a specific period is very hard. You're just getting like a 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 year range, or a couple hundred year ranges, something like that. Now, DNA evidence could be used to help solve this mystery. However, most ancient remains that have been found have been located on tribal lands. And while modern Aboriginal people seem to be fairly open for DNA testing for the living and the like, they do not like disturbing the graves of their ancestors and generally don't give permission for digging them up and damaging the remains for a chance. Again, a chance to find DNA. This respect for native burials is, of course, a new phenomenon, or at least a fairly new phenomenon. There was a famous group of early Australians found at a kind of a place called Mungo, which is a dried out lake. And one of these was called the Mungo Man. He was found in the 70s. And there were a couple of others people found there too, but he was the oldest. And they were removed without the consent of the local tribal group. And this has caused no end to controversy. Now, to be clear, the tribal group, I think in question, did not necessarily live all that close to the river, though, again, it's in their traditional kind of hunting grounds. And I don't know that the scientists even thought to ask the tribal group. At that point in time, a lot of study into the Aboriginal groups, like the past, was not really done. and there's a number of factors that play into that, and Mungo Man, again, will help contribute to some of the changes of this kind of thoughts, but we'll get to that in just a second. Now, the reason that this was kind of, groundbreaking at the time is that the remains showed that humans were in Australia prior to 20,000 years ago, which in the 60s and 70s was the time that the general scientific consensus of when the first humans arrived. 20,000 years ago was when everything they had found up to that point had said that humans had first got there. So as you can imagine, this caused a firestorm because these were remains that were, some of these remains were well older than 20,000 years. So this caused a firestorm and gave a big boost to kind of the multi-regional human hypothesis because it wasn't a typical Homo sapiens skull. It looked like it was maybe slightly archaic. It was kind of like a mix between modern Homo sapiens and, slightly more older versions of Homo sapiens. We're kind of in that transitory phase between the archaic and modern. So it was thought that this may have been like one of the regions that the first humans had evolved in, and then they spread out and met with groups leaving Africa, if you remember that multi-regional human hypothesis. Now, later finds in other places in Australia and all around the world made this find stand out a lot less. And instead, it eventually reinforced the theory that humans left Africa earlier than thought at the time. Once all the evidence worldwide was kind of taken into account. So Mungo Man kind of lost some of his uniqueness. He wasn't quite as shocking of the find. Now, but this was not the end of the Mungo remains' scientific impact or their controversy, though. DNA testing from the early 2000s on his remains returned some very interesting results, which didn't help matters with the local Aborigines. Essentially, the results published claimed that the test showed that these remains were not related at all to the local Aboriginal tribes. And essentially, these people were from an archaic strain of humans, and that it completely supported the multi-regional human hypothesis. Because they had more in common with Europeans than Aboriginals. Now, this immediately received pushback and criticism, and not just from tribal groups. A number of prominent out of Africa scientists were calling BS on the study, as well as others in addition to, of course, the tribal groups. Now, eventually the remains were repatriated to the tribal lands shortly after, I think around 2005 or so, maybe a little bit later. But during the period they were being repatriated, a different group of researchers requested and received permission to perform new DNA studies with newer techniques, and they got permission not just for the Mungo remains, but for other remains held by other groups. So in 2016, the findings of this new study by Wepink et al. Were published under the title Ancient mtDNA Sequences from the First Australians Revisited. I recommend you read this study. It is very interesting, but most of it is out of the kind of the scope of this podcast. But to summarize, they claim that the result provided during that earlier study were the results of contamination of the bones during handling, and that their tests show that all the testable remains prove to be ancestors of modern Aboriginal peoples, and were fairly closely related in some way or another with their modern local groups. Now, There's more information in there, and it will probably be mentioned in more detail in the next couple of seasons when we talk about Australia. But the whole reason I'm bringing this up, despite it relating to a time frame that we're not focusing on, is because it shows that the Australian Aboriginal peoples living at the time we're referring to are closely tied to the same lands and that their ancestors had been. These are not, vast, roving, migratory hunter-gatherer bands. These are very sedentary people. And that, that they not only maintained their lands, they preserved and passed down large portions of their lifestyles and tools from generation to generation. Or I guess I should say their knowledge of how to make tools were passed down from generation to generation for kind of the entire period that they occupy the continent. And they also passed down, interesting records of their occupation. And it's passed down in the same way that other traditions were, via oral tradition or oral history. Now, I'm going to talk about some of these records as well as kind of what we know of their religion. But I would like to talk about the tools that the Australians are using first at this period of time. Now, they are when they get to Australia, they maintain a more Paleolithic style toolkit. They don't have the micro blades of like other Neolithic peoples. They do have stone tools, of course, but they tend to be larger, and they interplay them a lot with wood and well carved and treated wood to harden them and make sure that they don't break and shatter. And it appears that part of the reason that they kind of keep to this older style of tool making is that Australia, apparently, from what I've read and kind of have seen on the map, they did not have access to a large amount of flint, which is very important for a lot of the more, micronized stone tools, things like that. There are very few places in Australia with, easily to get at flint deposits. I think there's only some places in the far kind of south central part of the continent. They did have access to chert, which is another good stone for making tools. Probably not quite as good for making things in the Neolithic fashion, but you can still get very sharp stones from chert. And chert's not it's not super abundant either, but it is much more abundant than, say, flint. And I think it was more widely spread for Australia. So part of the reason that they keep this older tool tradition is because they don't have access to some of the material that you see in some of these other Neolithic societies or tool cultures. But again, one of those videos I watched, it was very interesting because he kind of talked about how most of the tools of the Aboriginal people served at least two different functions. In some cases, they served far more than that. And I imagine that this is the case for a number of different societies. But one thing he was talking about boomerangs specifically. Most groups had two different types. You had a larger one that you could use for bigger animals, things like emus, kangaroos, humans, to defend yourself or to attack. These would not return They were either to be thrown kind of at a short distance. It would do good damage to you. It wouldn't cut you necessarily, but it would definitely bruise you, knock you unconscious if you were hit in the wrong place, break a bone or two. And in addition to being throwable, you could use it as kind of a very rudimentary club. Probably wouldn't do quite as good of a damage as an actual club, which they also had. That was something that could be done. But in addition to using these as weapons and hunting tools, apparently they would occasionally take two of them and kind of tap their arms together at the same time to create music. They were used as musical instruments. You also have the smaller variety of boomerangs, which I think we're more familiar with. These would return if they were thrown and they did not hit anything. But apparently they were favored to hunt things like waterfowl and birds. Essentially, you'd throw this into a flock of birds, and if you were good and lucky, you could hit one bird, and if you were very good and very lucky, you could hit 2, 3, maybe even 4. And it would do enough damage going through the flock that even if the bird survived, they wouldn't be able to fly away. And while your boomerang would fall, you could easily recover it along with the birds. And these two could be used as musical instruments as well. In addition to this, Aboriginal Australians also developed a small wooden shield. And when I say small, I mean it is very small. It is not much wider than a human body standing, like the side of a human, like from the front of your shoulder to the back of your shoulder. It would just cover that. And this would be used to essentially completely defend yourself from another human's attacks. That was its primary purpose. And you wouldn't hold it in front of you like you would a more traditional shield, or what we think of as a traditional shield. You would turn your body so it was narrow, and then you would have that in front of your arm, or coming up and covering your neck or your head, and then the rest of your body, you'd have to try to get behind it, get low and narrow. But even these shields served a dual purpose. Their primary purpose, of course, is defense. But they would have divots and lines in them to help, you direct a deflection or a weapon away. If you just had something that was flat, it could be pierced. It wouldn't necessarily bounce off you quite as well. But these divots were also places that they could load up with tinder or things like that, something to set a fire, and then they could rub the thin parts or edges of their boomerangs to kind of create a friction to help create a fire. So again, very utilitarian. Also, there are both male and female versions of these type, especially of boomerangs. Female boomerangs, apparently, at least in the tradition of the North Central Australians that the gentleman's father was related to, the male boomerangs typically were made from the branches of the trees, while the female boomerangs were made from the roots or the base of the trees. So he didn't go into detail of why that was done, but there's all kinds of ways you could speculate on that. But they also had various carrying implements that you would use to create dirt or carry water that were not clay or pottery. But they could also be used offensively to dig, carry children, carry other things that you wanted to eat, all kinds of things. And there were male and female varieties of those type of tools, or at least certain types of tools were more likely to be used by one gender than another. So this is all something to keep in mind. So, and yeah, so that's something that that I found very interesting, and it's something that I haven't really talked about too much since the first season or so. But it was nice to see very real examples of that, and it's something that has been passed down, orally. Those traditions. The reason they've done it is because, or the reason that they know how it was done is because it was continually done, even after the Europeans arrived, and in a lot of cases did upset a lot of different balances of traditional lifestyle. Now, that kind of leads me into talk about oral traditions and histories. Now, oral traditions are not unique to the Aboriginal people. All human societies practice at least some form of oral tradition. Now, literate societies, of course, practice this at a much less intense level, but we all have stories we tell about friends and families members, and we love to tell other people about these stories. We also have bedtime stories, which are very simple. They tend to be short. They're something that you can tell your children without having a book or something along those lines. And of course, everyone can tell a pretty detailed story about themselves if they have to. After all, who knows yourself better than you do? And you also probably know your parents pretty well and can tell people about them. As for your grandparents, if you're lucky enough to know them and know them for years, at least until you're cognizant, or you've obtained sentience, I guess, for lack of a better term, for getting to that age and understanding, about being an individual, about being a person, being conscious, I guess. You'll probably know a decent bit about your grandparents. But past that is when you run into a lot of problems. Basically, a living human, for most of history, can't usually accurately access more than 3, possibly 4 generations of memories, personally. You can talk to your parents, you can, of course, yourself, you can talk to your parents, you can talk to your grandparents. You might even be able to talk to your great-grandparents. Now, talking to your parents and grandparents is very good. You can understand a lot, but there are some things that you sometimes just have to be there to really know. And there, of course, is the issue with the retelling. You may forget a fact or a part of the story that your parents or grandparents told you, or you might change it a little bit just in the retelling to make it seem more interesting and more exciting. Now, these types of stories are tied solely to one family, and they usually disappear from memory and record. Now, stories that are remembered, past that period of time, that 3 to 4 generation period, typically affect more than just one family. But instead they affect many families, or whole regions, or whole groups of families, or even unrelated groups or families. Your family, a family across a valley, your family 10 miles down a river. There are certain events that affect everyone, or at least what appears to be everyone in your worldview. So all of these big events are preserved from multiple perspectives, multiple people across several generations. So, something like that tends to last a lot longer in memory and tends to be retold a lot, which helps it be retold. And there are instances where, you can talk to someone who was, say, like if you were young, say if you were in your late teens or early teens sometime then, you talk to your grandparents about someone they talked to when they were your age then. You're stretching it. You're probably not going to be able to get much further past 150, 200 years. I know one time, as an example, I was I was either in elementary school or middle school. We had someone who fought in the First World War come and speak to our group, and he was already very old at that point. But and I don't remember much of what he told us. I know what I've read about First World War. I know popular media depictions, but I do remember meeting him. But I don't remember necessarily his name. And we're at the point now where I believe every single World War I veteran's dead. When I was younger, there were still, I think, around 1,000 or so. I remember when there were much more than that. And soon it will get to the point where all the World War II veterans have died and passed away. So, right now we have this plethora of primary sources for all these things, or at least we have records of these primary sources, these people that actually saw eyewitness events. This is something that oral tradition and history, they record in a similar way, but it is, of course, this is something you have to memorize. This is something you have to practice. This is a skill. So, they probably were told these stories hundreds of times to remember them and pass them on. Now, the kind of stories I'm referring to, not the family stories, though I'm sure that there are cases of certain groups, hearing stories about a famous ancestor who went on especially a great hunt or, journey, something like that. I'm sure these stories are passed down as well. But the Aboriginals also give a great record of the land they live in. And we know that their memory stretches back even past the time period that we are referring to. Now, obviously, these stories in many cases take on mythological aspects. They are given additional details that probably were not remembered or passed on to kind of make them more interesting. But there are records of certain groups talking about the areas that they lived in, about floods and storms and things like that, that would line up with what we know about the rising water level. So we have very, very second or third-hand sources, I guess, of some of the major events, ecologically speaking, that take place in Australia. So this has led some to kind of conclude that the Aboriginal society here in Australia is, in fact, the oldest civilization in the world. Now, that is debated because, there is always a debate about what is a civilization. But in terms of collective identity, or at least try to think of the best term for this, not necessarily an identity, because again, these groups do consider themselves, separate from their neighbors. There are all these tribal identities. There are these ethno-linguistic identities. But there is a certain amount of, I guess you call it an overlap, in terms of their lived experiences and of their stories, their mythology. I guess maybe the best way to put it would be like a religious tradition that is passed down not just in one place of Australia, but in all across the continent. And two of these big examples that are passed down, in addition to their oral traditions about historic events, and I think it's important to note that their biggest traditions are, that are passed down, are these major events that are affecting not just them, but the land. but you also have other things that they have in common aside from these ecological events. They also have religious stories or mythological stories that they pass down and that they share in common. And I'll talk about those here in just a moment. But of course, there are certain stories that they pass down that are about things that happen well beyond human occupation of Australia. Things like Ayers Rock or Uluru. There's a story of how that was formed. Now, obviously, that's been there for millions of years. Humans can't have been here while that was happening because the first hominid probably hadn't even evolved by the time Uluru was created. But there are aspects of the Uluru creation story that could have been based on a real thing. There's a mention of two brothers being involved in the creation. It's very possible that two brothers could have been involved with some type of event that took place at Uluru. Perhaps they were involved with the carving of some petroglyphs in the area, that kind of thing. But, there are certain events, obviously, it was not possible for humans to see, but that's not to say that stories related to those events could not have happened in some roundabout way. And then, of course, just as time went on and the desire to make your story more interesting or to tie in these famous ancestors or heroes of your group, you might not try to mythologize them. Or the retelling of these stories may not have grown in importance. Or there might be a type of either a euphemism or something's happening that the meaning changes over time about what they're doing. What this person does might change over time. Like the meaning of what the term you're saying that they did changes over time. And I really look forward to this when we talk about some more comparative mythology stuff. But I think the Aboriginals, aside from some of the Khoisan groups, probably have at least the longest religious traditions. If not, again, you can debate about civilization, that kind of thing. You can debate of whether they qualify for that or not. But I do think it's safe to say that they do have this kind of long-standing religious tradition that is definitely, if not number one, probably number two or three. So that is something I do kind of agree with, though I'm kind of skeptical on the civilization stuff. And I think I'll go into that. We definitely will go into that in the future. But I'm going to talk about their spiritual and religious traditions. But there is something that does change in this society, and it's something I haven't really touched on at all, and that is language. There is a very big shift in the Aboriginal languages, at least according to linguistics professionals, due to the estimated age of the various language families in Australia. The language itself is not all that old. And there is some thought that there may have been some type of outside migration into Australia, and not at any large level. It would be something small, maybe something that's culturally or religiously significant, or set off like kind of this revolution in ideas among the Aboriginal themselves. It may not have been like a large scale migration that changed genetics vastly, but it could have set off like a cultural or spiritual revolution or religious revolution. But we'll talk about later. That happens probably 2 or 3, a couple seasons from now. But there are some aspects of the Australian religion that we know are older than that event, and are probably as old as the period of time we're talking about, and definitely maybe even older. Now, of course, there are very old rock art petroglyphs, red ochre paintings, which are red ochre is the oldest form of medium. Red ochre on stone, as far as I know, is the oldest medium that humans have been working with. And there are, some kind of overlap in certain areas between various traditions, but I guess the largest overlap, or the widest spread figure in Aboriginal mythology or religion is the Rainbow Serpent or Rainbow Snake. It's very much considered by some as kind of a creator god, and it has a lot of different names. And while different groups do have slightly different versions of the tale, all of them have some type of overlap, or share certain common aspects. I'm not going to go into names and stuff right now because, again, linguistically speaking, these names don't exist just yet. But know that I think there are I think modern Aboriginal languages, there are over 200. I don't think there are quite that many names for the serpent. There's not a name for each group, but there are at least 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, there's over 24, I think, at least, and there's probably even more than that. It's not something that's very well preserved in English because there are so many names. But generally speaking, it's just referred to as a rainbow serpent. And the serpent is very important. It creates land. It is a bringer of rain in certain situations. It also brings wealth, though not in the way we would associate wealth, but like more wealth in terms of environmental wealth. It relieves drought. It brings animals. It brings blessings. All kind of things that you would want as a hunter-gatherer. Anything good it can bring. I'm not aware of it being angry or like kind of a punishment in any way, but I'm sure that there are instances. Now, it should also be noted that because Australia is so large, there's a lot of different environments. So certain environments emphasize different aspects of the serpent's kind of blessing. There are people who live kind of in an area that gets a lot of monsoon rains. The serpent protects them from these rains, but also kind of gives them the benefits of it. It's kind of something where it is great and terrible, but it is not vicious. So that is something to kind of keep in mind. So I do plan on diving more deeply in specific stories of the Rainbow Serpent, but again, I'd like to kind of wait until we get to the part where the languages are more identifiable, just so I can use the name or talk about the specific group, because tribal identities typically tend to be fairly flexible, at least among the people themselves. Obviously, sometimes when you get sedentary groups referring to them, they might tend to group those people together much closer than they actually are, or they might try to perpetuate an identity that no longer exists between groups. But that being said, obviously, if tribes might form and break apart, but anyone that's living is carrying all of their kind of wherever their background is, they're carrying that forward, whether or not they call themselves by the same name as they did 200, 300 years ago. Also, you have a number of kind of regional, not monster stories, but kind of fantastical creatures that may occupy various parts of, you know, of the world or of Australia where these people are living. Most famous, I think, would be the bunyip. It's kind of said to belong to swamps and rivers and water holes. That's like a big Australian kind of cryptid that always pops up. But obviously, people in the desert, they don't necessarily have the bunyip. But there are other regional kind of monsters, or cryptids, or kind of dangers. So there is kind of a regional variance for all that kind of thing. And there is a theory that the bunyip and other kind of creatures like that actually may be based on, like, I believe it's the marsupial tiger, which is obviously not a tiger, it's a large marsupial. And it's kind of really the only it's kind of the only large predator that the Australians had to deal with. They obviously didn't have anything terrible that they had to deal with in terms of, like, they didn't have lions or tigers the way you do in Africa or India or China. They don't even have dogs yet. The dingo shows up later, and it is maybe related to that mystery when talking about linguistics that I mentioned. It's very possible. I think the marsupial tiger was a little bit larger than I think it's the thylacine, which is like the Tasmanian tiger, which is now extinct, of course. I think it lasted longer on Tasmania than anywhere else, but there was probably a mainland variation as well. But yeah, so it's thought that the bunyip might have been an exaggeration memory of having to fight off these vicious giant rodents that are trying to steal your kills, or attacking your children while you're not looking. That kind of thing. That kind of deep fear that just worms its way in and never leaves. Something like that. Now, the other kind of overall tradition that permeates a lot of Australian religion and belief is that of the term in English is the dreaming, though it is also sometimes called the dream time, which is kind of related to the Jung quote I used at the start of this episode. And this has been debated. There are some people who say that, dreaming is a terrible translation of this. It's something much, much different. But it's kind of, some people use the term everywin, or it's like a collective unconsciousness, or just kind of like saying, a long time ago in a kingdom far, far away, in terms of like fairy tale telling, but it's not a long time ago in a kingdom far, far away. It is the here and the now, but it's the now, but in the past, but it could also be somewhere far away, but it's the same people. So it's a very complicated concept to try to translate to English. And this is something that's probably evolved a lot. And this is probably one thing that has kind of changed a little bit more than maybe stories of the rainbow snake, just because of how esoteric it is, but that's just me maybe projecting. It's obviously a very old concept, but it might be something. I'm trying to think of the best way to explain it. But it's kind of I guess it's everything that a human can think about but not control is a way that I kind of try to imagine it. But it's something that humans can be more active in participating in. There are religious, things you can do to kind of enter the dream time, or to, I guess, get lost in it, or try to commune with the dream time. So it's kind of a mix of a number of things. It's a mix of animal worship, ancestor worship, worship of land, or that it's kind of tied into a lot of different things. It's a very large concept, and I can definitely understand the criticism of the word "the dreaming" or the translation of "the dreaming," because that is not at all a good way to describe it. But honestly, to come up with a better term is very hard to do. It's something that because I thought about it for like 2 hours, and I'm like, yeah, I cannot make a dent in this. I can see why people would debate it, and I can see why it's such a interesting concept. But this is something I look forward to returning to, because the dreaming is a very interesting concept, and it does kind of relate to a number of different philosophies that are not Aboriginal, but are maybe related to some of the Chinese philosophies. And that might be one of those comparative things to think about when we get to more, I guess, modern, or not modern, but more, I guess, concrete sources when we talk about Chinese religion and things like that. But let's see, how long have we been going here? Wow, over an hour. Okay, yeah. So this has been a very long episode. I would like to dive more into the concept of the dreaming and the kind of the Rainbow Serpent, because I do think they exist, at least in kind of proto forms, if nothing else. There are cave drawings depicting snakes, and that they are kind of considered representations, and the motifs are reused in more recent rock art that everyone agrees is indeed the Rainbow Serpent. Now, whether it's kind of this omnipotent, omnipresent, beneficent being at this early stage is something of a debate. Australia is going through a very tough time at this point in our story. They are just now getting their modern borders in terms of sea, or coastline. 6,000 BC is probably the latest that they're having to deal with a lot of the flooding, or the rising tides, and they've always had to deal with dry spells in the center of the country. And with the rains adjusting because of the end of the Younger Dryas period, the continent is probably getting drier. They're getting less rain, less regular monsoons, and there are probably lakes and rivers that have been drying up for a while now, and this is something that's affecting them. So they might be doing. They might be trying to call forth this Rainbow Serpent, or summon it in the way that we think earlier hunter-gatherers and Neolithic, in Europe, or people making cave paintings. They're making these sympathetic carvings of something they want to come. Snakes, being out in the rain, being in water holes. This is something that they're probably very much trying to attract. They want snakes, maybe because they think the snakes bring water, or something along those lines. It's hard to say, but I do think the concept, if it's not fully formed, is very close to fully forming, or it is something that is beginning to evolve into a much more active kind of maybe worship or prayer for. That they're maybe trying to get this extra rain or this protection from this rainbow serpent. Yeah, so I think that's something that's going on, and of course, the dreaming. That's something that's very kind of nebulous. It's hard to dive into for sure, but there are paintings that have like a kind of a jumble of different symbols and peoples and just figures that we aren't even sure what they are. And even over Uluru, you can see, great swaths of the stars. The Milky Way will sometimes be visible over that at certain times of the year. They made a lot of petroglyphs, kind of not far in the southeast of Australia, near Aora, and I forget the other people, but there are very large petroglyphs that they've made. That these people, these large kind of drawings of human figures. That these are, I think they're made prior to this period. Some I know were made after, but I didn't double check that. But there's a lot of spiritual activity that these people are clearly involved in that is kind of outside, that's very different from what we're seeing in other places. They definitely have their own traditions, or at least they've evolved radically from what the people they broke off from are doing. I think that's kind of a good place to stop right now. It feels like there was something else I wanted to talk about very briefly. We've got the Rainbow Serpent. We've got the Dreaming. Yeah, I think that's it for now. This was a very long episode. I hope you all enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to feedback here. I did try to come up with some more to talk about firmly, but this is all so far, in the past. It's hard to kind of talk about without bringing in the best known sources for things talking about this are from more recent times, and it's definitely after some period in the future. So I don't want to jump too far ahead more than I have to. I think etymology is fine to do that because obviously we have these terms, and I like to talk about how we have them. But yeah, so next week, unless I think of something that I missed pretty heavily, we'll be moving on to Europe. I'll probably do like a general overview episode, and then I'll dive into kind of various groups from there. Europe shouldn't. Well, I shouldn't jinx myself. I shouldn't write myself into a corner here. But Europe probably should only be a few episodes, so it won't probably be as long as Asia. Of course, it's not nearly as big as Asia, but obviously there's more information in English I can talk about. There's more groups, but I'm gonna try and kind of keep it succinct. Don't want to overstay our welcome there when we still have the Americas to get to. But we're kind of in our last stretch here for season 3. We should be done with that. Let's see, it's the 3rd week of August. We should be into season 4. I would assume sometime in October, though I need to determine if season 3 will end with kind of those episodes I've been talking about, the part 2 of the domestication of crops and animals, or if we'll be talking about urbanization as part of this, or if that might all be part of season 4. But of course we do have our October kind of break, so that's kind of a good time for me to work on all that stuff and plan it out, where we have our kind of our less serious episodes for October. If those of you that don't know, last October I kind of did some kind of pseudo historical slash sci-fi slash fantasy stuff to talk about. It gave me a little bit more time to kind of do research and scripting for the actual history stuff, because I do occasionally get kind of thin on material. So yeah, but we're moving along pretty well. But thank you all for joining me this week. If you have any questions or feedback, you can reach me at war@revpod@gmail.com. You can contact me on Twitter via direct message, or you can just @ me. I'll have the link to my Twitter bio in the account. You can reach me through commenting on any of my YouTube videos. You're welcome to do whatever you like. But I do hope to hear from you. I enjoy hearing fan feedback. I've gotten someone who I've been speaking with the last couple of months here. He's given me some good feedback on some audio stuff, and some things I'd already been kind of thinking about. But it's always nice to hear from people about that sort of thing. But yeah, please let me know if you have any questions or feedback. I'd love to hear from you. And yeah, I hope you like, listen, subscribe, all that kind of good stuff, wherever you're able. And I will see you all next week. Thank you all so much. Have a good rest of your day. Goodbye.